Yeah, got to. Oh, yeah.
Okay, this one.
새로 하는 수가 있어서 한 1, 2분 뒤에 하도록 하겠습니다. 화면
교수님께서 저 20계정으로
포스트 해야지. Speak complicated.
Sure. Yes.
Bear with us. 1 second.
It's always complicated with these things.
하고.
Okay.
Okay, today's host will be Professor Kyung-Han Lee, and he will introduce our distinguished guest today. Actually, we are alumnus from Princeton, but it's so happy to see one of our graduates here. So, please, Kyung-Han.
Yeah, today I'm really happy to have Professor Colloquium Jung from CMU. He's going to present something very interesting about this federated learning, which is what is quite hot in the field of coaching and the field of the machine learning as well. So I'll briefly introduce Colloquium. Colloquium Jung is the Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Colloquium University. She received her AB degree, a bachelor degree, with magna cum laude in mathematics, and a master's and PhD degree in applied and computational mathematics from Princeton University in 2011, and 2013, and 2016, quite recent, right? Respectively from Professor Mang Xia, who is now the president of Purdue University. And Professor Wong's research is in optimizing network and the machine learning stuff. And from 2013 to 2014, she was the director of advanced research at DataMe, a startup company, which is working on some data delivery over to, what is the audience of the DataMe?
Cellular optics.
Cellular operators, right. It's a real, really happening in some countries like India, right? The research has received several big research awards, including an SF Korea Award in 2018, and she also received the InfoCom Best Paper Award in 2012. Now, please give him a big hands. And, yeah. Thank you.
If you like, because everybody is wearing masks, you can, unmask and just to speak clearly.
Thank you for the introduction, Kyung-Han, and I'm very, very happy to be here, and I'm happy to see everyone. Can everyone hear me in the back of the room? Okay, great. So I'm very pleased to be sharing some of my recent research on end-to-end optimization of user contributions to federated learning. I should say this work was mostly done by my former PhD student, Ijin Guan, who is currently at Meta, as well as several other students, postdocs, and collaborators. So the motivation of our work is that if you look at machine learning today, of course, we all know there's more and more applications where people are trying to use machine learning to solve various tasks. But one of the trends that we've been seeing is that one of the enablers of all these machine learning applications is that more and more data is being collected and more data is being stored in cloud servers. And one of the reasons for that is because cloud servers are very resource rich. So there's a lot of computing resources available in the cloud to process this data. But then there's a slight contradiction, because if you actually look at how the data is being collected, most of the data is not actually being collected in the cloud or at data centers. It's really being collected at edge devices. So things like the Internet of Things, sensors, smart homes, smart cities, etc. So if you sort of look at this complete architecture, you see that there's all these kind of things at the edge of the network. And then their data is somehow being sent over communication networks to the cloud, where all that data now is being analyzed. So this can work for some applications, but this also introduces some new challenges, because as you can see, there's now this extra step of how do we actually get the data from the things where it's collected to the cloud where it can be analyzed. And kind of bridging that gap is where federated learning comes in. So again, if we sort of look at the physical infrastructure where all these machine learning applications are being run, we have these sources of data to be analyzed. And then in order for it to be analyzed successfully in the cloud, you first need some wireless networks that kind of connect these devices together and enable the communication of data. And then you need the computing resources.
Sorry.
Sure. This kind of setup is always difficult. We go through this every day when I teach. So yeah, in order for these machine learning applications to be successful, now you don't just need computing resources, you also need wireless networks. And
Sorry to interrupt. Would you please use our microphone?
oh, sure, yes.
So, the room is so big, I didn't expect a large audience. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wow.
That's much better.
Much better. Let's see. So, right. So in order to run these machine learning applications, we need not only computing resources, we also need wireless resources. And these may be constrained for various reasons. So for example, some of these sensors or sources of data to be analyzed are very low power. So even if you wanted to communicate all this sensor data over the wireless network in real time, the radio on these sensors may not be able to handle the power required for such communication. You may also have devices that just collect enormous volumes of data. So if you think of an autonomous vehicle, for example, it's basically collecting live video feeds of its surroundings whenever it's in operation. That's a lot of data to be sending all up to the cloud for analysis. So that motivates a slightly more distributed version of machine learning. So this is not something that the federated learning researchers came up with. This idea has been around for a while. But basically the idea is you have data stored on different clients. So in this Internet of Things setting, these clients may even be different. So you might have some data being collected by a smartphone, some being collected by, say, a sensor mounted on the wall in this room, et cetera. And the idea is now, instead of just kind of blindly sending this data to the cloud to be analyzed, each client will try to do some sort of local analysis on the data. So if the goal of machine learning, as it often is to use this data to train some kind of model that relates input variables to output variables, then you can maintain a local version of the model on each client. And then because you do want to kind of leverage the data at all the clients to learn your model, you can have some kind of central parameter server. So each client maintains a local model, updates this model every so often, and then sends this copy of the model up to the parameter server. And the goal of the parameter server is to combine these local updates in some way. And then they can send back the combined updates to all the clients, and this goes on in multiple iterations. So this idea of distributed machine learning has been known for a while, and to some degree it does address some of these challenges I was talking about of limited ability to communicate data from devices to the cloud. But it turns out this doesn't address all of the challenges. So two of the big differences we see now with federated learning, which have emerged in the past few years, are first, these devices can be really heterogeneous. So I mentioned this example where you may have some data being collected on a smartphone or sensors embedded in a smartphone. Some data may be collected, let's say on sort of standalone sensors mounted on the wall here or out on the road outside this building. And so these different devices may have very different training capabilities. They may have very different abilities to communicate data, et cetera. And we would like some way to account for this heterogeneity when we're trying to use all these devices to train the machine learning model. The other big difference that is kind of related to this idea of heterogeneous training capabilities is that the data these devices collect may also be heterogeneous. So I have kind of a schematic of a very simple example here, but if you imagine you're trying to, say, train a machine learning model to predict how many cars will be on the road at different points in a roadway, you may very well want to leverage data from multiple traffic cameras at different points of the road, because the model that they learn can benefit from looking at data, from different points. On the other hand, different cameras may see very different data distributions. So for example, if you have a camera on a kind of side road in a suburban area, the types of cars it will see, the types of traffic patterns it will see will look very, very different from something that's mounted, let's say, on a freeway in the middle of the city. So you have this heterogeneity, not only in what devices are capable of, but also in the types of data they collect. So to be a little bit more mathematical about this, the way this manifests in the machine learning problem is you may have some global distribution of data. Maybe your probability distribution looks like this black line. But then if you look at the different clients or different devices, they may collect different numbers of data points that relates to this heterogeneous training capabilities. Maybe one traffic camera collects 30 data points an hour, one collects 200. And the distributions may look different. So maybe one is concentrated towards the right of the distribution, one is concentrated more to the left. And then there's this question of, okay, how do you account for this heterogeneity in this distributed machine learning paradigm? Because that's not sort of typically considered in distributed learning. So how does federated learning do this? So this is kind of an overview of how federated learning works. If you've worked in this area, this may look familiar, but if you haven't, I hope this helps make things clear. So the first step of federated learning is something that we call client recruitment. This is often ignored, but I think it is important. And the question this tries to answer is, well, which devices are going to contribute to your learning process? So what devices are you going to actually have available that you can later call on to collect data for you, compute updates, et cetera? And then once you've recruited these clients, so for example, you convinced a bunch of people to install your app on their smartphone, now the different training iterations begin. And the first step in the training iteration is something we call client selection, which is to say, in this particular training round, for this particular model update, which clients are going to participate. And then once you decide that, the clients have to actually participate. And the way they participate is by computing these local model updates that we saw. And that includes two different stages. So one is the actual collection of data. So you need some data to kind of update your model on. And then there's some process of model estimation. So typically the model estimation, if you're familiar with this, is gradient descent. So you try to minimize the loss function on the data points you just collected. But there are variations of federated learning where you have other types of model estimation. And then once each client has computed these updates, we have this aggregation step. So again, this happens at the central parameter server. And the question the parameter server is trying to answer is how should these potentially heterogeneous updates from different clients be combined? And then we just repeat this over and over again. So where we see this, this challenge of heterogeneity in client capabilities and client data manifests is first in client recruitment. That's why I've highlighted that in red. So we should be aware of these heterogeneities when we actually recruit the clients in the first place. And then in the local updates, clients may recruit different types of updates. And then at the server, we need to somehow harmonize that when we do this aggregation. So in this talk, I'll be trying to discuss how we can harmonize these updates in recruitment, data collection, and local model estimation, and then in aggregation. So this slide here is just trying to sort of show how kind of the typical operation of federated and distributed learning may change if you have this client heterogeneity and these limited resources. And for each step in our process, we see that there's a different kind of change. So for example, in client recruitment, typically you just try to recruit as many clients as possible. But if you have limited resources, you may say that some clients may just be too slow or may not collect enough useful data for it to be worth recruiting them. If you look at data collection, typically the server will just randomly select some set of clients and say, all of you collect data for me. But if you have limited resources, you may get into a situation where only a few clients can upload data at any time. So for example, in a sensor network, all these sensors may be competing for bandwidth. And then you have to figure out which sensor should be allowed to upload based on kind of how useful their model update is going to be. If you look at the local updates related to data collection, again, in typical operation, every client uploads whenever they're requested. So the server just sends the requests and then the clients do what they're told. But if you have this client heterogeneity, you may have a situation where even if a client wants to upload, it can't, because either it doesn't have enough available resources, maybe someone turned off their smartphone, so that smartphone is no longer available to help us learn our machine learning model. And then finally with aggregation, so typically the aggregation is just a fancy way of saying you take a weighted average of all the client updates. But if you have some missing updates, incomplete updates, if you don't have updates from some clients, then there's this question of, well, what do we do with the missing or incomplete updates? And how do you factor that into the aggregation? So you probably need to do something a little more sophisticated than just taking a weighted average. So in this talk, I'll try to address sort of all of these challenges and show you how at least we have been approaching this in our recent work. Okay, so the first part of the talk is optimizing client recruitment. So this is some work that appeared in YOP last year. So again, client recruitment is kind of the initial step of federated learning. This is where we determine which clients will be available in the first place for us to request updates from. And here we see that we have to consider sort of multiple different factors in doing this client recruitment. So in particular, the challenge here is that if you look at the clients you're recruiting, whenever you recruit a client, you're actually recruiting the client for multiple roles. You're recruiting it to collect data for you, to process model updates for you. And then the client may also be a user of the machine learning model that you're actually going to train, and it may attach some value to being part of this machine learning model. It may also attach some cost to doing all this data collection and processing work for you. So there's these various factors then that kind of come in. And in this example here, I've tried to illustrate how there could be trade-offs between these different factors. So the images here are motivated by one of our ongoing collaborations with the Duke Lemur Center. And we're trying to look at how federated learning can be used to recognize lemurs in their collection. And in this made-up example, we may have two devices, let's say two cameras, and they may be very different. So for example, one device may collect less data. So device 1 collects 30 data points versus 200 for device 2. They may have different computation capabilities. Typically, this is correlated with the amount of data they can collect. And they might have different costs for how expensive it is to them to do this data collection and processing for you. And they may have also different data distributions. So you can see, similar to the example we saw before, maybe one device may collect data very concentrated on this part of your overall distribution. Another device may have slightly more representative data. But again, here we see device 1 is more representative data, but it's also much more expensive for device 1 to actually help us in this local training. So that leads to a trade-off. And we have to decide, well, which device, or should we choose both devices, et cetera, in our client recruitment. So you can formulate this as an optimization problem. So you can try to quantify the various performance metrics you're interested in, and then try to kind of optimize for various points on the trade-off curve between different performance metrics. And that's basically what this paper is about. So the metrics that we looked at were, first we tried to look at the model accuracy to say, okay, if we recruit this client, how accurate is our model going to be? And this sounds simple, but it turns out it's actually a little bit complicated because you have to consider different types of accuracy. In particular, we'll see that accuracy consists of both the actual training loss on the data points that will be collected by your chosen client, as well as the ability of the model to generalize outside of whatever clients you've recruited. And then there are also efficiency considerations. So you want to make sure that your model finishes training on time, right? And if your model takes 2 years to train, it's probably useless. And then you may also have a cost constraint. So you may not want to spend too much energy, spend too much money to train this model. Okay, so I guess this is the first equation of the talk. So again, you can formulate this as an optimization problem. The way we formulated it is we had this objective function of accuracy, and then we have various constraints. So one is a constraint on how representative the data is. That is, how well does it resemble the data on which you want to actually use this model you're going to train. Again, completion time constraint and cost constraint. And your optimization variable here is just, should I recruit each device or should I not? So let's say you have K candidate devices. Maybe there's K locations where you might be able to put cameras in the lemur area. You have to figure out, should I put a camera there or not, given all these metrics. So the main challenge in this paper was actually not really solving this optimization problem, but more quantifying. How do you actually measure each of these sort of different objectives in our optimization problem? So I wanted to give you a sense of how we did that and why that's challenging. And then I'll show you how we end up solving this. So the first metric we have is something called training loss. And this again is supposed to help us measure what is the accuracy of our model going to be after we actually train the model. So this, we realized, is proportional to what we call the quality of the data set. That is, its similarity to the population distribution. So the population distribution here is the distribution of data on which you're actually going to run the model. So you can see these examples here on this slide, or on this graph. You have this red distribution and yellow distribution corresponding to different clients. And you can see they're very different from the underlying population distribution. So this probably means that the data you're getting is going to be lower quality, because if you train on this data, right, then your model is going to be specialized to this red or yellow distributions. It may or may not perform well in this underlying sort of population distribution. Whereas here you can see the red and the yellow distributions much more closely resemble the population distribution. So you have a much better chance of actually getting an accurate model when you throw it at data from your population distribution. So you can quantify this by the deviation in your probability distributions between the distribution at the client and the overall distribution. The next metric of model accuracy is generalizability. So even if you train your data on, or train your model on high quality data, your model may or may not actually generalize well, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to be training on some finite number of data samples. And if you have too few data samples, even if they come from the right distribution, they're not going to be able to generalize to the rest of the distribution. So data quantity also matters. This was actually one of the main challenges of this paper, which is figuring out how to quantify this ability of the model to generalize, because that's something that, at least in typical machine learning, people tend not to consider quite as much. So the way we ended up quantifying this is to look at first the generalization error. That is, if you get new data from the selected distribution, sort of how well is your model going to be able to generalize to that? And we were able to show this as a function just of the amount of data you're collecting. And then there's another issue of representativeness. So if you have new data from unselected distributions or other parts of your population not represented by your recruited clients, you can try to measure sort of how this, how well your model is going to generalize to this new data. Right. So this again is our optimization problem. So we talked about the training loss, generalization error, representativeness. I won't go into the completion time and cost because those derivations are a bit more straightforward. But once you have sort of expressions for all these things in terms of X, then you can try to solve for X. And now the challenge becomes, well, this is a binary optimization problem. So X can be either 0 or 1. So that means that we can expect it will not be very easy to solve. It's a combinatorial optimization. As it turns out, it's not that bad though. So we were able to show that if you ignore your constraints, or if you assume that, let's say, no matter which clients you recruit, completion time, cost will not be an issue, then all you have to do actually is compute a statistic for each client that relates to the quality and quantity of its data, order the clients by this statistic, and just figure out the threshold above which you recruit the clients and below which you do not. So that leads to a relatively simple and polynomial time algorithm for actually recruiting clients. So this is a very, very nice finding. It means we can actually solve our optimization problem. Of course, in practice, you may actually care about these constraints. And in that case, we essentially adapt dynamic programming to show that you can still solve your problem without too much of a computational issue. Okay, so the last part of this paper, we tried to validate this on real data. Because one of the big challenges of client recruitment is looking at this idea of generalizability across models. We looked for a while for a very realistic data set where we could actually look at the distributions of the real distributions of individual clients and see how picking those distributions would affect the overall model. And we settled on a data set of weather stations across the United States. So we looked at the data collected by each weather station. Of course, at different locations, right, you can observe different types of weather. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the data these clients can collect. And we trained a linear regression model to predict the daily snowfall at different locations. And so these are the results. So on the y-axis, I'm showing the test error relative to the least squares optimal solution. And this optimal is our benchmark. You can see this has the lowest test error. It actually even goes below 0 compared to the least square solution, meaning it's even better than the offline least square solution. And we also looked at what happens if you only consider clients by the amount of data they collect, if you only consider clients by the quality of the data they collect. And in both cases, you end up getting a higher test error than you do with our solution, which tries to balance both of those factors. So this is a nice way to validate that client recruitment actually does matter. And if you recruit the right clients, you should end up training a better model. Okay, so that was sort of talking about client recruitment and how you manage heterogeneity in client recruitment. But of course, there's other stages to federated learning. So in the rest of this talk, I'll be talking about these local updates and disaggregation and how you can manage those in the face of heterogeneity. Okay, so I've divided this kind of into 2 parts. One is addressing research constraints and one is addressing data heterogeneity. And in both cases, we'll show that there are ways to modify these local updates and aggregations to address these 2 challenges. Okay, so first, resource constraints. So when we started thinking about this problem, one of the kind of obvious ways that we started thinking about modifying local updates was to say that, all right, if the problem is that some clients don't have enough, let's say, resources to compute local updates, okay, yes, yeah. Sorry for the interruption.
You can read Korean, I guess.
I can see colors, highlighting buttons. Yeah, so if the problem is that devices don't have enough resources to compute these local updates, maybe they can ask each other for help, right? So especially in an IoT setting, you may actually have devices that could be directly connected to each other, not just connected to some kind of central base station. Some examples of this are maybe you have AR, VR enabled devices with varying battery levels. So maybe the clients with low battery can ask clients with more battery to help run computations. Maybe if you have internet connected vehicles, some may be in a really good signal quality area able to connect to a central parameter server, some may not be. So the idea was, well, now how do we, or how should these clients ask each other to kind of help with the local updates? So how do we optimize the distribution of model learning across these various network topologies? So again, this becomes an optimization problem, and the structure of the problem depends a lot on the topology of the network you're looking at. So for example, you might have something here which is much more hierarchical, or you might have something that's kind of more arbitrary, or different devices are connected to each other. And you have constraints both on devices' abilities to communicate. You may also have privacy constraints on sharing data between devices. So this was actually one of the potential problems we realized, which is that even if I'm able to, let's say, send data from a sensor to someone else's phone for that data to be analyzed, maybe I don't want to send that data to this other person where they can see what it is. So you may have these privacy constraints. Okay, so how do we formulate this as an optimization problem? So we formulate the network as a graph where we quantify which devices are connected with each other. We assume each device collects some given number of data points. And we associate with each device a processing cost and a processing capacity for these data points. And then on each link, we also associate a link cost and a link capacity. Okay. And then the idea is each device should look at its processing cost, processing capacity, link cost, link capacity, and try to decide what should I do with this data I've collected. So there's three options. One is to just process the data itself. Of course, this incurs some processing cost. One is to offload to another device. And we'll see this can also incur costs. And the other option is just to discard this data. So maybe the device says, well, it's too expensive for me to process the data or send it to someone else, so I'm just going to ignore it. Of course, this can have implications for how accurate your model is if you keep throwing away too much data. Right. So you end up formulating an optimization problem. So I'm not going to go through the mathematical notation, but I think the high-level intuition is not too complicated. So basically what we want to do is we want to minimize a combination of different costs. One is the computation cost. That's the cost of processing data points. One is the transmission cost. This is the cost of sending data to other clients for them to analyze it for me. And then finally, you have the error cost. So this is the expected increase in error you get if you start discarding data and not incorporating it into your model. And there's various constraints. So the important constraints are constraints on how much data you're allowed to move. So this is related to the capacity of each link, right? If your link has very low capacity, you can't send a lot of data to whoever's on the other end. And there's also a computation capacity. So you can only process so much data at a given device. If a device is exceeding this capacity, then it cannot accept data from others and process it for those others. So this becomes an optimization problem, despite the many notations. As it turns out, we can actually approximate this as a linear optimization problem. So the real challenge here was really this error cost. And again, that's because we have to quantify the model accuracy as a function of whatever data it's taking in, which again is not something conventionally considered in machine learning. But we were able to adapt some convergence bounds of typical machine learning models in order to quantify this. And once we adapted those bounds, we were able to show that you can actually approximate this as a linear function and still approximately solve your optimization problem. So then once you have a linear approximation, this is a linear optimization problem, so it's not too difficult to solve. So then the last step of this was, again, trying to validate this, right? To see, will this idea actually help in practice? So here we considered the MNIST handwriting image recognition data set. I think most of you probably are familiar with it. And we constructed a test bed of 6 Raspberry Pis. So these were our clients, and they all connect, you can see here, to this server. And we compared our network-aware learning, so that's our solution, to both centralized learning, where we assume all the data is generated in one place, and traditional federated learning, where we don't try to allow clients to kind of send data between each other. So you can see that all of these accuracies for these different models are quite comparable, right? So this shows that our network-aware learning doesn't actually achieve lower accuracy in practice, despite the fact that some data is actually being discarded if it's too expensive to include in the model. We also then quantify the cost of network-aware learning. And here's where you really see the benefits of our solution. So if you look at the cost here, this is actually half that of traditional federated learning. So with no offloading or discarding, you have a cost of around 2,000. We get this down to about 1,000. And we're considering 2 types of network-aware learning here. One is with perfect cost information. So if you know exactly how expensive it's going to be to, say, send data to someone else. Of course, in practice, you may not know this because of things like fluctuations in signal quality. So if you don't have perfect information, we show we can actually still do relatively well. We also looked at this in the context of different types of network connectivity. So we collected a bunch of LTE and Wi-Fi measurements for the Raspberry Pis. And we looked at the different costs for different network topologies. The main takeaway here is that if you look at LTE, the processing cost dominates for LTE. Whereas if you look at Wi-Fi, the transfer cost dominates for Wi-Fi. And intuitively, this kind of makes sense because with LTE, you typically have lower connectivity costs than Wi-Fi. At least in the data set we were looking at, we actually had better LTE connectivity than Wi-Fi. So that means that the processing cost was really what we really cared about. So we were trying to get that down. Whereas with Wi-Fi, if we were transferring data between devices, you incur large transfer costs. And that became the main thing that we had to minimize. Okay, so that's talking about sort of these local model updates. But then the next step, right, is modifying aggregations. So in the previous work, we did not modify the aggregations at all. We just said, clients are going to compute data or compute updates on whatever data they get. And then this central server doesn't really care what the clients have done among themselves, just computes this weighted average. But in practice, that may not be the best thing to do. So in particular, if you actually look at how federated learning is being used by Google today, clients typically participate in the optimization only when they're charged, plugged in on an unmetered Wi-Fi connection. So what that means is that this can be impractical for real-world clients, right? There may be situations where clients may not be available to compute updates. So we saw that one way to compensate for this is for clients to ask each other for help, but that may not be sort of a comprehensive solution, right? So there may be scenarios where you can't ask each other for help because everyone around you is also resource constrained, right? Or maybe your device just ran out of power and there's nothing you can really do. So that was the challenge that we tried to address in this new work. So this appeared in AI Stats a couple years ago. And the main contribution of this paper was to say, all right, if you have these clients that could be sort of arbitrarily unavailable, how do we modify the aggregations, given that these clients can be arbitrarily unavailable and there's not too much we can do to help them compute local updates. So we considered sort of 4 categories of clients. One is incompleteness. So clients run fewer local updates than required. So typically in federated learning, clients have to run sort of multiple local iterations to update their model, but they may or may not actually run all of them. You could also have inactive clients where clients just don't respond. So this would be the case where, say, a client is turned off. And then we also looked at situations of late arrivals or early departures. So clients may join after the training has started or depart before the training ends. And of course, before they arrive or after they depart, these clients cannot participate in the learning process at all. So in this talk, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on incompleteness and inactivity, but the paper also talks about late arrivals and early departures. Okay, so in order to better understand sort of what is the impact of these missing clients or incomplete clients, let's take a slightly closer look at what this federated learning is actually doing. So the goal of traditional federated learning is to minimize this objective function. So here the W is your decision variable. These are your model parameters. You have some data sets of a certain size. And for each point in the data set, you have some prediction error, which is a function of your decision variable, your model parameters. And you're trying to choose the right model parameters to minimize your prediction error over your entire data set. So how do you do this? Again, we have multiple clients. In typical federated averaging, each client computes gradients of its prediction error a few times. Then sends those updates to the parameter server averages them, and sends them back down to the clients. Now, if we have flexible device participation, you may get something like this. So maybe client 1 computes gradients once, client 2 computes gradients a few times, client 3 does nothing at all. And then this, of course, will be reflected in the updates that are pushed back to the parameter server. And in response to this, one of the simplest things the parameter server can do is, instead of doing an unweighted average, they can try to take a weighted average. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, how do you choose the weights? So that's something we'll see in a few slides. If you choose the weights in a even slightly intelligent manner, you can actually get much better convergence guarantees for this kind of model. So we first looked at the convergence of this idea, assuming arbitrary weights, and we were able to show this bound here. So, okay, ignore the mess of equations below. The important parts are that the convergence bound is proportional to something called m tau divided by tau. So tau here is the number of iterations. So you can see that this convergence bound goes to 0 as long as m tau is less than O of tau. So as long as m tau grows sublinearly with tau, this thing on the right goes to 0, right? And the thing on the left is your error. So what is m tau? Well, m tau will be sublinear if inactivity is not too frequent. So as long as clients occasionally contribute updates, if you sort of go into the equations and you look at what m tau is, it will not grow linearly with tau, so you will converge. And if we look at our convergence bound in a little more detail, which I won't really explain too much in the interest of time, you can see that if you choose your aggregation weights to compensate for missing updates, then you can actually improve this convergence bound. So you can try to optimize this equation here by choosing your aggregation weights intelligently. So what do I mean by intelligently? It's actually not that difficult. So scheme C here is our proposal. So we try to use all of the updates from all the clients, but the weights that we get are reciprocal. They're reciprocal of the number of completed updates. So we said that clients may have incomplete updates, right? Maybe they only run 1 or 2 local iterations instead of however many we ask them to run. So to compensate for that, we just take 1 over the number of updates and we use that as our weight in the aggregation function. So not too complicated. right? And I'm comparing here to what I call scheme A and scheme B. Scheme A is a default where you only use complete updates. And scheme B uses all updates, but fixes the aggregation coefficients. So scheme A, we might imagine, won't do very well because it throws out a lot of information, right? Let's say half your clients weren't able to complete their updates, you're throwing out updates from half your clients. Sorry.
야, 온라인 참가하시는 분들한테 공지합니다. 지금 약간 넷 발표자 랩탑에 약간 이상이 생겨서 다시 셋업 중이니까 1, 2분 뒤 바로 시작하도록 하겠습니다. It's almost back to normal.
Okay.
I'm sorry about the glitch.
Stuff is complicated.
In retrospect, I think you didn't have to click on that blue button. I think it was like OS update. Anyway, let's start again. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, yes. So, right, so different aggregation schemes. So yeah, as I said, throwing out incomplete updates or not compensating for incomplete updates, generally you would expect doesn't perform well. So on the next slide, this is kind of the intuition behind why we look at the reciprocal number of completed updates. So here, each line represents a client, and each arrow represents a local update at the client. So you can see these red clients here sort of don't fully complete their updates. So if you look at scheme A, it only considers 2 clients. So you're throwing out a lot of information in your model, so that slows down convergence. If you look at scheme B, if you don't compensate for this incompleteness of the updates, what you're sort of doing is you're taking a very skewed average, right? So you're taking complete updates and you're trying to average them to be the same as the incomplete updates. Whereas with scheme C, by taking 1 over the number of complete updates, we're almost projecting from where the incomplete updates left off to where they might have been had the client actually completed everything. So you can see visually here, you have a much less skewed update, and therefore you might expect that your convergence is going to be better. And this is actually what happens. So if you look at our convergence bounds, you can see when you have heterogeneous clients, so heterogeneous here means clients have different data distributions.
Don't touch, maybe the black button.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so if clients have heterogeneous data distributions, scheme A and scheme B actually don't always converge. So that's what this red stuff means here. Scheme C, however, may converge. Again, tau in the denominator here just represents the number of training iterations. And as long as this variable IT here is less than tau, we actually do get convergence, right? So this thing here is going to go to 0 as tau goes to infinity. And what this IT is it's essentially an indicator of how inactive the devices are. So as long as devices are not inactive too often, our scheme, despite being very simple, is going to ensure convergence. Okay, so the next step, of course, was to try to validate this. Again, we did this by looking at Raspberry Pis. Each of them is collecting data, and we tried to measure sort of how likely it is that these Raspberry Pis may have incomplete updates. So to do that, we assumed each Pi has a training process, and we also ran a CPU-intensive competitor process at the Pi. And then we tried to calculate, well, how many local updates could the Pi complete within a fixed amount of time for each training round. So you can see here that as we increase the intensity of the competitor process, so the subscript here is the intensity of the process, we see that we go from completing 100% of the rounds to something like 50%. So depending on sort of how much computing resources you have, you may very well see very incomplete updates from your devices in practice.
Blue button, please.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is the main graph. So here, the scheme A is this green, and I'm showing the test accuracy on the y-axis. So you can see scheme A does really, really badly, right? Its accuracy is very low. So somewhat surprisingly, scheme B doesn't do all that badly. So that's this red dashed line here. But as we increase the heterogeneity of our devices, so going from left to right, you can see that the scheme C, this blue line, does do better than scheme A, although it is a bit noisier. Again, this is because we have these incomplete updates, so the amount we have to compensate is kind of going to increase. Okay, so the last part of the talk goes back to the two main challenges I mentioned, which are first heterogeneity in training capabilities, and second heterogeneity in data. So I talked a little bit about heterogeneity in data, but we didn't really talk about how to compensate for it, right? We just said it's kind of there and it affects our convergence bounds. So how do we address this? So this appeared in AAAI earlier this year. And to address this, we actually kind of changed the goal of federated learning a little bit. So we said, well, if you have data heterogeneity, as long as your goal is to train a single model for all clients, there's not all that much you can do to address data heterogeneity, because your model is going to be the same, meaning it's going to predict the same things for all clients, even though these clients may be looking at very different types of data. So the key idea here was whether we can try to learn a model for each client's specific distribution. Going back to the example of surveillance cameras on a road, maybe we can learn different models for different cameras. So for example, the cameras in a sort of suburban side road, right? The model associated there may be more likely to predict lower traffic than a camera on the freeway that often sees very high traffic volumes. So of course, the naive way to do this is to say, well, why are you doing distributed learning at all? Just have each client train on its own data set and then call it a day. But there may still be some similarities, right, between the different devices that we do want to take advantage So the way we try to do this is by saying, well, can we cluster similar devices together? So for example, you may have multiple cameras on a freeway, right? And maybe it's fine for them all to use the same model because they see very similar traffic patterns. And then the challenge becomes, well, how do we kind of group these similar devices? So the goal of this work was to first find a way to cluster devices and learn models for each cluster. And then also on the way, we ended up learning these personalized per client models as well. Okay, so this is sort of the intuition. Again, each client may have a different data distribution. And we modeled each client as having a mixture of a few underlying data distributions. So here there's 3 underlying distributions, and you can see different clients sort of draw their data from different mixtures of these distributions. We end up with personalized models for each client, and we also try to cluster some of the clients together. So for example, if some clients draw heavily from distribution 1, then we might end up clustering those clients together and give them the same clustered model. Okay, so I don't want to get too much again into the mathematical details. You can always read the paper for that. But the general idea of the algorithm was that you really have 2 things you want to do here. So first is to discover which clients should be clustered together. And second is to figure out, once they're clustered together, what model should you be training for them. So keeping with those 2 goals, the training algorithm kind of has 2 parts. One part is each client computes its fractional similarity to the current cluster models. So this kind of tells you how similar clients are to each of the current clusters. Server randomly selects clients to train each model, and then the selected clients update the model for each cluster according to these similarities that they've kind of pre-computed. So as you can sort of see intuitively over time, clients are going to contribute more to clusters they're more strongly associated to. That's going to associate those clusters even more strongly to these clients. So at the end of the day, you'll end up with this very nice clustering of different clients and accurate cluster models. All right, so we were actually able to show this convergence. Again, as always in federated learning, there's many notations, but the important notation here is that we're able to show a convergence bound in terms of a parameter that we call delta. So delta measures the heterogeneity between clients, and more precisely, if you look at the optimal clustering of different clients, it measures the maximum distance between 2 different clusters. So the more similar clusters are, sort of the worse your convergence count is going to be. So this is that's shown in this corollary here. So we were able to show that the actual convergence rate depends on 2 factors, one that decays linearly over time, and one that quantifies this client heterogeneity. So the intuition behind this is that here delta, again, is the maximum deviation between clusters. This little delta is the minimum deviation between clusters. So as clusters become sort of more homogeneous, we end up converging faster. And intuitively, this kind of makes sense, right? Because you want clients within each cluster to be very similar, so you can easily learn a model on them. But you also want the clusters to be far apart, so that it's easy for you to kind of separate the clients into different clusters. And that's kind of what the equations are quantifying here. So again, we tested this on some, I think this was synthetic data actually. So here on the top, I'm showing the accuracy of the different cluster models, which are the 2 different colors. And you can see that the accuracy sort of converge. On the bottom, I'm showing the similarities between different clusters, or between what we think are the different clusters as we run the algorithm. And you can see that sort of, this is the similarity to cluster 1. And you can see some clients converge to 1, some clients converge to 0. This is the similarity to cluster 2. So again, some converge to 1, some converge to 0. So what this is showing is you're getting this nice separation between clusters. And you can see that even more clearly here. So here we're comparing to some baselines, which also try to do this clustered federated learning. So IFCA does hard clustered learning, where you only associate clients with 1 single cluster at a time. And FedEM also considers a mixture of distributions, but their training process is a bit more intensive than ours. So we consider 100 clients. The first 50 are from one distribution, the second 50 are from another distribution. You can see IFCA can kind of figure out these two distributions, but it does make some mistakes. So the one here is one cluster, the 0 is another cluster. FedSoft kind of figures out, right, that all these clients should have one type of similarity, these clients should have another type of similarity. What was kind of surprising is that if you look at FedEM, which is these green data points, even though their training algorithm is much more computationally intensive, you really don't see any visual difference between their cluster similarities for one group of clients or the other. So we think this shows sort of the superiority of our approach. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so let me quickly wrap up. So to summarize, many network systems today do require information from multiple sources to be combined in a timely manner. And typically the way we do this is by trying to train a machine learning model. So federated machine learning can be used to fulfill these requirements. And we showed that if you look at different stages in the federated machine learning process, you can modify not just client recruitment, but also local updates and aggregation to handle these challenges of increased data and computational capability heterogeneity among devices. We showed in simulation that these ideas actually work. And I just wanted to include one slide of future work. So here on the right, this is sort of how I envision different sorts of applications and resources running on multiple different devices. And one of the questions the higher level questions we're trying to answer is, how should this network of devices work together? We saw how you could do this to train one or multiple models, but there could be broader questions as well. So if you look outside machine learning, how do you distribute applications among devices? How do you coordinate data transmissions between power sensors? We didn't talk too much about the coordination of data transmissions in this talk. And how can you run multiple machine learning applications? For all these papers, we only considered running or training one machine learning model, but in practice, you may be training multiple models on data from the same devices. All right, so again, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions, and this is my email address if you would like to talk more offline.
Thank you very much. Just give her a big round of applause. We have actually covered a lot of topics in the federated learning, and I guess most of the students in this room are quite interested in doing some machine learning, especially in the federated learning, because they are also working on communication topics as well. So can we have a couple of questions from the floor? Are there any? Yeah. In the clustering setting, maybe you can use this microphone.
In the clustering setting, I think the number of clusters is very important parameter. So I have a question that how can you determine the number of clusters?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And honestly, it's, yeah, that is very challenging. One thing you can try to do is start with a large number of clusters and then sort of monitor kind of how devices are associating with them. And then you may be able to figure out like, oh, all these clusters look really similar, so maybe I should just make this one cluster. That's not something we integrated into this algorithm, but I think it wouldn't be too hard to integrate it and it would probably do okay. Yeah, but that's definitely a challenge.
Any other question? Actually, I have one more question related to your point of like end-to-end optimization. So when I have to create a big model based on this federated learning approach, always thinking of seeing some inefficiency, like the model is basically trained with some generality, and then it goes back to the device to make it specialized. So is there any idea to make it more efficient? Because we don't need to actually create that like large general model, because I'm gonna end up with using my own model. Right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that's a bit different from how people usually think about federated learning, but I think as we try to apply these models, that is exactly how they will be applied in practice. You train a general model and then you need to kind of specialize it. So yeah, believe that some of the work in this talk and also that other people are doing to make training more efficient could help with that. So for example, you could imagine very quickly trying to train one model and then being a little more careful in kind of training the specialized models once you actually see the data where you're actually going to be using these machine learning applications. So one thing I think is very interesting is trying to look at, well, how do you kind of control the amount of resources you're putting on, right, for these two different cases?
Yeah, I have some related question.
Yeah.
So in the FabSoft, do you kind of manage like multiple models at the parameter server and from the parameter server's point of view?
Yeah. So actually we have, I guess, one model for each cluster. And yeah, that does lead to a little more training overhead. But if you look at the optimization problem the device is solving, that's actually just one problem. So it's not too
when
bad.
each client maybe upload their gradients, there must be some kind of a tag where
Yeah.
whether it's related to one cluster or another cluster, or maybe the ID, client ID can distinguish that, I guess.
Yeah, so I didn't really explain this, but basically what happens is each client computes its similarity to all the clusters. So when it sends back its gradient, it also sends those similarities. And those numbers are used to determine how much this client's gradient should be accounted for in each cluster.
So I guess you're measuring similarity in terms of data distribution. What kind of specific measure have you been using?
Yeah. So ideally it would be data distribution, but in practice that's kind of difficult because each client only knows its own data. So we were looking at just the similarity of the loss function because the clients do know the global loss, but they don't know the global data.
Okay. Thanks.
Inspiring talk. So I guess my question is on the third work where you were considering some inactive clients. So I guess you're doing some adjustment, but still I'm pretty sure that the models are suffering from some stale weight. So I guess my question is, how much gap do you have between the upper bound, if you set the upper bound as just collecting all the data first and then performing a non-federated learning? I mean, I just want to find out how much room there is to improve if I were to jump into that topic right away.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess I'm not sure what the exact quantitative amount is off the top of my head, but there's definitely room to improve. Actually, there's been some other recent work that tries to reuse stale model updates. And I think they actually get better convergence bounds than we do. We're also sort of working on that on some work that's under submission. But yeah, I think that's definitely a fruitful direction. There's a lot of room to improve this work.
All right, thank you. Okay.
Hello, I'm Jung Park from Professor Kamal's lab. Very interesting presentation, and I have a question about the scalability of the system. And I want to ask if the piped converge or bankers of the system would be better with more number of clients, or would the scaling be linear or in the general?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. And I think, so there's kind of multiple factors. Yeah, maybe I can use this. So there's multiple factors that can go into how this scales with the number of devices. So sort of intuitively, more devices equals more data, right? Which means better convergence. One of the issues there though is when you have more devices, you can get more heterogeneity. So your model may need to generalize to other sorts of distributions, and that can definitely cause convergence issues because now you're testing your model in a more difficult setting. The other thing that can happen, which we were considering a little bit in the client recruitment work, was as you have more devices, you also have more variability in their training capabilities. So there's a much greater chance that if you have some very slow devices, who are slow relative to others, they're going to slow down your training a lot. So if you look at convergence with respect to like walk-off time, not just number of iterations, that can suffer a lot as you have a lot of devices. Yeah.
We have any other question from the audience? Professor Kim? Okay. I think we can wrap up here. Now, please give her a big hand once again. Thank you all for coming once again. See you guys in the next ShaRing Colloquium.
Thank you.